Welcome everyone as we take a deeper look at the second reading from this past Sunday's Mass. And Sunday was September 20th. It was the 25th week in ordered time, or what we call ordinary time. So, a reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Philippians. Brothers and sisters, Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, life is Christ, and death is gain. If I go on living in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for you. And I do not know which I shall choose. I am caught between the two. I long to depart this life and be with Christ, for that is the far better. Yet, that I remain in the flesh is more necessary for your benefit. Only conduct yourselves in a way worthy of the gospel of Christ. The word of the Lord. Thanks
be to God.
So, this is the first of 4 weeks that we're going to be reading from the letter to the Philippians. A little background here. The letter to the Philippians was written to Christians who were living in a city in Greece called Philippi. It was named after Philip, who was the father of Alexander the Great. So the people living there were called Philippians. And you know, sometimes as a priest, and I've been a priest since 1988, so like 32 years, you hear all types of things that people say at Mass. Sometimes this has been called the letter to the Filipinos. Okay, so it's unbelievable what people say. It's the letter to the Philippians. It's the first of 4 weeks. So I'm a priest for 32 years, and I was reading this morning just to get ready to have a few words to share with you. I came across something about this letter that I never knew before. A lot of scripture scholars feel it's not one letter, it's really 3 very, very short letters that Paul wrote that after he died were stitched together to become one letter. Now, like I said yesterday, I knew that Isaiah the prophet was that way. It's really 3 separate people that we lumped together. We call it Isaiah the prophet. I never knew the letter to the Philippians was also possibly 3 letters that were stitched together. Okay, next. You know, Paul spent a lot of time in prison. People try to add up the time, the hours, the days, the months, the years he spent in prison. And they can't get it because we don't have a real strict chronology of his life. But Paul was probably arrested 6 or 7 times. We know he was arrested in Ephesus. He was arrested in Jerusalem when he was sent to Rome, where he ends up being killed. And he was also probably arrested in Philippi. So he wrote this letter when he was in prison. We don't know where, but he was in prison. And he's writing it to the Philippians. And he's probably aware of his own possible death and martyrdom. So that's the background to the letter. When he's talking about death, he's not talking about just dying as an old man. He's talking about being martyred for the faith. So here we go. Brothers and sisters, Christ will be magnified in my body, in my life, whether I'm martyred or whether I continue living. He says, for me, life is all about Christ. Okay? And death, if I was to die the death of a martyr, that would be a gain. It might spread the gospel in a way that my preaching doesn't. So this is what Paul says. If I go on living in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me and for you. I'll be able to work hard. I'll be able to make all these journeys. I'll be able to preach. I'll be able to form missionary churches and establish leadership teams and then go into the next one. So Paul says, if God lets me live, fruitful labor. If God calls me home, well then, that's okay too. Paul says, I'm caught between the two. I long to depart this life and to be with Christ, and that really is the far better choice. Yet, if I remain in the flesh, it's more necessary for your benefit. So he's kind of in a predicament. That's what Paul is on to. Then he says this, he says, listen, at the end, it's the very last line, whatever you do, just conduct yourselves in a way that's pleasing God. So I'm dealing with whether I'm going to die or live. Whatever you do back in the city of Philippi, just know that hopefully I'll visit you one day and just behave in a way that pleases God. So that's a little background. How do we put this section of Paul's letter into practice? Well, Paul's reflecting on life and death. That's always an appropriate thing to do. We tend not to do that. It sounds kind of morbid. But being aware of our own mortality and our age and our health and the fact that things are passing by, that might be a good reflection. 2 weeks ago I turned 60, and I can't believe that. I'm the age when I used to think my parents were really, really old, and now there I am. So, it's good to reflect on our life and on our legacy and what we're leaving to the next generation, and that's what Paul was doing. So I would encourage you to do that. Also, Paul encourages the people in Philippi that whatever they do, make sure that they're living a life pleasing to God. So I would encourage you to do that as well. Live a life that's pleasing to God. Do things this week, very practical things, that put a smile on God's face and that please God. And if we do that, we'll be putting this section of Paul's letter to the Philippians into practice in our lives. Thanks, everyone. Come back for the next couple of days, and we're going to be taking a more in-depth look at the gospel, of course, and how we can apply it to our lives. God bless.